So, there's a question I ask everyone at the start of every interview. Could you introduce yourself and say what it is that you are known for?
I'm John P. McCann. I'm best known for writing, producing, and story editing animated TV shows from the 1990s at Warner Brothers, and after that, complaining about not having enough work.
What is your earliest memory of film or television, whichever one comes first?
Well, with TV, it was a lot of cowboy movies back then, a lot of cowboy shows. With movies, the two that stand out were The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, which was Ray Harryhausen stop-action animation, which just blew my mind. When I was a kid, I didn't know you could do things like that. I thought it was illegal. And then the other was George Pal's War of the Worlds, which was just so amazing when you're young and you just see this amazing stuff up on the screen. It just really inspired me.
And was War of the Worlds sci-fi the kind of media you consumed as a young man?
Yeah, I very much loved sci-fi, monster movies, all the kind of fantastic things. There was a magazine out then called Famous Monsters of Filmland, and it was just something I'd grab at the drugstore every month that it came out. And they got in-depth interviews, behind-the-scenes stuff on whatever was new and coming out. It was just, and always paid homage to what had gone before. I was very impressed with that.
What other hobbies did you have growing up?
Models were big back then. Model ships, model planes. Loved those things. Also comic books. My brother and I were voracious readers. DC mostly, some Dell comics. Friends of mine showed me Marvel, and I thought they were interesting, but at the time, they used to serialize a lot of stuff, and I just thought that was such a ripoff. You know, when you're a kid, it's a month is an eternity. So I like the ones that where you picked it up, you paid your money, you read it, and you got the story, and you didn't have to go back for more.
Where did you grow up?
Chicago, North Side, and then in the suburbs, Skokie.
What was your formal education?
Grammar school, great time there. Went to 2 different high schools and really was losing any interest in education at that point. I was mostly interested in partying with my friends and doing as little as possible. So this left me with a grade point average in negative numbers. So when it finished with high school, I really had no interest in college or anything like that. So I went into the service for a couple of years. Came out and studying didn't look so bad after that.
I bet. When you came, where were you stationed, by the way? And was it the Army specifically?
Marines. I was in the Far East. Okinawa, went to Taiwan, and then eventually came back and spent the rest of my time in South Carolina.
And when did you first start doing stand-up?
Back in Chicago. I got out of the service. I was working for this big insurance company. And a friend of mine worked there told me she'd gone with her boyfriend over to this comedy club where every Thursday night anyone could go up and try it. So I went there and checked it out, but then I didn't do anything for a few months. And then finally went up and said, laughs, those are nice. I stayed with it for a few years.
Do you remember the kind of jokes you told?
Oh, God. It was really comedy 101. It was, girlfriend, movies. Inflation was big back then. Lots of inflation jokes. You could still make fun of Nixon and get a laugh. You could just say Nixon and people would laugh. They assumed it was, it's more social bonding than anything else. Just the whole thing was to get time. That was the big thing, was to develop time. Jokes that worked 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15, because you couldn't really go anywhere, come out to the West Coast or anything until you had a respectable amount of material.
When did you move to LA?
1979.
And what was your first job in Los Angeles?
The first job I got paid for was working at a security company in their main office. They had all their burglar alarms come into what was called a central station. So I would sit in there and monitor these alarms all night, and any of them went off, I'd call the cops, and it was pretty dull. I read a lot.
And how long did you have that job?
About 2 years.
And when you came to the West Coast and you were working at that securities company, did you get into improv right away, or how long did that take?
It took me about a year from when I started there. It was a magazine called Dramalog, which used to be the casting paper of note, and they every week put all the jobs and all the films casting or plays, and it was a must read. So I saw this group, LA Connection, and I thought I'd give them a try. Ended up staying with them for a while.
And what type of group were they? What made them unique from other improv groups at the time?
They only did improv. In other words, it was just improv comedy and not sketch comedy, where, like the Groundlings, where people would write little sketches like you see on Saturday Night Live and perform those. These guys just did straight improv.
And how long were you with that group?
2 or 3 years, I guess.
And then you joined M.D. Sweeney?
Well, down the line.
Okay.
I met Sweeney at the LA Connection. I met his wife, Sherri Stoner, and a lot of other people who would play a big role in my life in the years to come. And we've been friends ever since. But when later on he started an improv group based initially out of people from the LA Connection, he gave me a call, and I think this was 1989 or so. And that's when he started what later became the Acme Comedy Players.
And what made them different from LA Connection?
I think overall the quality was a lot higher. We started getting people in from Groundlings, which were the premier group at the time. So they'd come in with established characters and written sketches, and we were able to really assemble a couple of good shows there and start recruiting new people to form groups behind us. But it was tough at first because we didn't have a name, and we were one of 10 trillion improv comedy groups in town. So it was tough. A lot of times you'd perform for a handful of people.
Is that where you met Paul Rugg?
Yes. Well, I met Paul through there. He wasn't in my cast. He was in another group coming up. So we sort of passed in the night for a couple of years. And then when Sweeney finally started his group, that's when we really got to know one another.
What drew you to him, or what makes him unique?
He is a funny guy. He just made me laugh. He had all these characters he'd do, and he would just commit 100% to them. Excellent improv.
Now, is it true that you worked as a double on a film about Errol Flynn?
Yes.
Talk about that.
I don't know how I got that. It was through the LA Connection, but I guess because I was somewhat as tall as the Canadian actor who was playing Flynn, they wanted me to be his double aboard ship. So it was actually kind of fun. They fitted me for his costumes, and then I drove down to Newport Beach, and they had a 2-masted ketch that they used in the film, and we sailed out near Catalina Island, and so they'd talk to somebody through a radio, and then they'd be hidden, and they would tell me what to do. They would stand, take the wheel. Okay. Here, hold a drink in your hand. Okay. And then the helicopter would fly by, and it'd shoot me, and it was fine. And because I was the featured guy that day, they gave me scopolamine because I was the featured extra, and then the other extras were given Dramamine, which was not as effective.
And how did that affect them?
They were sick as dogs, or completely unconscious, one of the two. I was fine. I was completely high.
What was Reefer Madness 2, the true story?
Yes. Well, I was also through the LA Connection. A guy had gotten the rights to the old Reefer Madness. And so the LA Connection had a thing it was doing at local theaters where they would get an old movie and then they'd sit in the front and improvise dialogue, turn off the sound to the old movie, and then just come up with new characters and new business. And he saw that and thought it'd be good to have us do Reefer Madness as a movie. So that became something we worked on for quite a while. It wasn't improvised by the time we got done with it. Everybody practically had their lines memorized. It was more like a play.
And what was that something that you performed live, or was that marketed?
No, it was marketed. He got it in a couple of film festivals, and I thought he might have sold it at one point. I'm not sure, but the LA Connection went on. They started doing, they did a TV show, I think, in the late 80s, which was basically the same thing. Because they would take old movies and they would come up with new dialogue for them. I was gone by then.
So how did you end up getting hired at Warner Brothers?
Well, it was through, again, Sweeney, and Sherri Stoner was working on Tiny Toons at the time. And Sweeney and I were working together in his improv group. And she had been picked to develop a new show about Elmira, which was going to be a breakout from Tiny Toons. So she hired myself and Peter Hastings and Deanna Oliver, and I think Nick Hollander, who later wrote on Anmaniacs, he was with us on that. And that we would show up and pitch ideas and try and think of what this show would be. And we had to come up with a family for her and a world that she lived in. And eventually I wrote a script for it, but somewhere along the line they pulled the plug on the show. So I think the script eventually ended up on Tiny Toons, which became my first Warner Brothers show.
Had you seen the show, Tiny Toon Adventures, prior to working on the program?
Yeah, I mean, I knew Sherri was working on it, so I'd watch it. I thought it was pretty clever, different from a lot of the other stuff that was out back then.
What was that pilot going to be? What was the format, rather?
Oh, sitcom-y sort of thing where, centered around Elmira and her fanatical love of pets, and also as much take some of the burden off of that, put it on some of the other family members, her father and her mom. I can't remember if she had a sibling. I don't think so.
Now, had you been a writer, non-animation-wise, prior to that pilot script?
Yeah, I had done a show for a guy. I can't remember. It was similar to dubbing old movies, except that he would get old Japanese animation and then attempt to come up with storylines for it for an English-speaking audience. I don't know how I met this guy. Anyway, I worked for him for a little bit and did a couple of shows for him. But I mean, it was really, you're shoehorning in stuff with images that didn't really fit. I don't think it ever went anywhere. You probably tried to sell it back to the Japanese.
Now, was that non-translated, or was that based off the...
You had the lip flaps of the characters, so you had to kind of shoehorn your dialogue into that and make it fit, and then make it fit with whatever action they were doing. Contrived comes to mind.
What made for writing an animation script different from writing a regular piece of media, or a regular script for that matter?
Animation, you have to know what they can do in a hurry, the artists. In other words, there are limitations. If you call for 10,000 people, they can't draw 10,000 people. They can't come up with individuals. You got to think of your shots in terms of what can be done quickly. I didn't know this at the time. I'd always call for 10,000 people and then get pissed off when they wouldn't give it to me. But there are limitations that they can do when they're under deadlines like that. So it's, even though you can fashion anything that your imagination can think of, you have to bear in mind that it is a business and they have to turn out. There's only so much time in the day for them to turn stuff out.
How did you come to work on Anmaniacs? Was Anmaniacs the first thing you worked on after that failed development?
Yeah, we did nothing happened for a while, and then I heard from Sherri, I think she said they had this new show that was in development, and they wanted to give Paul Rugg and I pilot scripts just to see how we did. They were sending them out to a bunch of writers just to see, who had a take on this show. They still didn't know what exactly it was going to be. So I think my first was Draculaa, and Paul's might have been Cookies for Einstein. I'm not sure. But I had no thought anyway of anything beyond just selling a script. It was right around Christmas, and I was broke. So I was hoping to get some Christmas money out of this and worry about next year when it came. But then they called us and said, we want to hire you. And that was numbing, but we said, yeah, why not?
Now, what job had you been working while you were writing the script? Were you out of work at that point, or did you have a different job away from the security firm?
I was done with them. I had been working as an editor for a magazine, so that went up a few months before Animaniacs, and then I quit that. And I was working as a temp. Computers were so new back then, especially Macs. They had a separate organization that sent you out to work in companies that had Mac computers. So I was doing that whenever I'd get a job, a couple of days here and there. When they called me, that was much appreciated.
Can you describe Animaniacs for someone who may never have seen it? And good luck with that.
Yeah, 3 insane animated characters wreak havoc on the lives of people who deserve it. That sums up about 85% of the shows.
So, can you describe, I've got the full list of episodes you wrote. Can you describe what the plot for Draculaa was?
Yeah, the Warner Brothers are en route somewhere, and they accidentally end up in Transylvania instead of Pennsylvania, and they run into Count Dracula and mistake him for a variety of things that he is not, and basically turn his life upside down.
What percentage of the scripts for that show were the Animaniacs, Yakko, Wacko, and Dot turning the lives of other people upside down?
Quite a few of them, if you think about it. Plain Pals was another I did. It was basically you had some bloated financier like Ivan Boesky, who was popular back then. You have them sitting next to him on a plane, driving him nuts. Einstein was a little different. Paul's were a little, they helped him in that one. They helped Einstein discover things, even though they drove him nuts too. The one with Michelangelo, they drove him nuts. Daniel Boone, they drove him nuts. That was their mission in life.
My favorite, Boot Campin.
We had I don't know what that was originally, but the story wasn't working. So they gave it to Paul and I, and we had to basically ADR, which is come up with new dialogue for it and a new storyline. And, we had some fun with it.
What was the typical workday at Warner Brothers like in those early years?
Well, early on it was very sweet. Everybody had their own office. We'd be like women in a laundromat going from, door to door visiting and saying hi.
Did you have a script writing process that was different from, say, another person's script writing? Did you have notes? Did you plan out in advance? Did you write as you went along? What strategy did you have for writing an animation script at that point?
Yeah, varied. For Animaniacs, sometimes we'd have as little as just a paragraph. The Warner Brothers meet Joseph Stalin. You know right where to go with that. So you could fire away with that and see what you came up with. I'd always try and sort of think about where was it going and where did I want to take it. You're under a certain amount of deadline, so you couldn't dawdle too much. But mostly it was trying to make it as funny as you can.
So the show had other characters, not just the Warner Brothers and Warner sister. You also had Slappy Squirrel. Could you describe that character?
A bitter former actress who takes it out on people who deserve it and tries to help young Skippy along in life.
And who played the voice of that character?
Sherri Stoner.
Rita and Runt?
Dog and a Cat Looking for a Home, with a song somewhere by Rita, Bernadette Peters.
Did you ever write for the Pigeons?
Yes, I did one for them. It was World War I, and they were fighting a German plane.
Now, why did you write so many songs into your scripts?
Well, animation is work for hire, is what they call it. They paid me every week, and I turned out material, and there were no royalties to it. However, when I found out that songs paid a royalty through one of broadcast music or one of those, I started turning everything into a light opera. I think they told me to cool it after a while.
What were those checks like, if you're at liberty to say?
They weren't too bad at the time because the shows were running all over the place. But it's all based on airplay. So they've dwindled down to ceremonial at this point.
How many of those segments did you write for Animaniacs, if you can recall, rough estimate?
Oh, all told, maybe 20 to 30 perhaps.
Oh, and the obvious one, the one that will later spin off, who are Pinky and the Brain?
Oh, laboratory mice, classic smart guy, dumb guy, except that the smart guy wants to take over the world despite being a mouse.
Because eventually it spun off into its own series. Was that the first show that you wrote for Warner Brothers aside from Animaniacs, or did Freakazoid come first?
No, I think I did a Sylvester and Tweety mystery in there, and that was before Freakazoid.
Can you describe that show?
Animated mystery with classic Warner characters, sort of like Agatha Christie, the TV show. It'd be Granny and then Sylvester and Tweety.
And you wrote 3 of those: Cat Who Knew Too Much, The Platinum Wheel of Fortune, and Chip Off the Old Castle. Any memories of those scripts?
Chip Off the Old Castle, I remember. I tried to get as many names of my cousins in there as I could. But they were fun to do. I enjoyed. I enjoyed anything that had the classic characters, just because I'd had such a love for them growing up.
What was your favorite Animaniacs that you wrote, and why? You can do more than one if you would like.
Yeah, well, Draculaa, certainly. It was just a blast. Death or consequence, or no, Meatballs or Consequences. I enjoyed that one. That was because Tom Ruegger had a tremendous fight with the studio because they didn't want to use death or consequences in there. They didn't want to use the word death. In fact, we couldn't say death throughout the whole thing. So we're doing this parody of the Seventh Seal, and we can't say death. We have to say unalive. And we were lucky. Things are much more tedious now in terms of management and censorship.
Did you have to deal with censorship other than the aforementioned death or consequences when you were writing for those early Warner Brothers shows?
Very little. There was a censor over at Fox where the shows were airing. Very light pencil. They didn't want things like imitatable violence. Like I think in Draculee, Draculaa, there was a scene where Yakko pulls out a bat, and they didn't want him pulling out a bat and hitting Dracula. So they got around it by pulling out a bat and putting a face on the bat and then putting bat ears on the bat. That passed muster. It was so pleasant. All you did was go there, show up, and write. And, you'd deal with Tom or, whoever. Sometimes there was somebody story editing, like Tom Minton was for a while, and I think Paul Rugg was for a while. But mostly you just worried about what you were writing and the content of the show. It's almost unheard of.
What was it like working for Tom Ruegger?
He was a very dynamic guy, and if it was funny, he'd laugh at it. He wouldn't nod his head and point or anything else like that. He'd laugh, and if he didn't get it, he'd say so. So you were never in doubt where you stood with Tom. But all he wanted, I think, at base was the very best. And so he was willing to experiment, willing to try, willing to listen to new ideas. So I think he was a big part of the success of those shows.
Now, did you work directly with Steven Spielberg? And if so, what was that like?
I did not, no. I was in meetings with him. I met him a number of times. I have to say, for a guy that powerful, he was really, he'd always come up with ideas. Say, what about this? Or you could do this, or you could do that. But he never insisted that they be put into scripts, which I thought was really reasonable of him. I mean, at the beginning of Anmaniacs, he was making Schindler's List, and then he went right into doing Jurassic Park. So we'd get faxes from Poland or Hawaii, and he'd have little notes on the scripts. I thought, wow, he's in the middle of all this, and he's taking time to read the scripts. So it was great. We'd go to see him over at his company, Amblin, which was over on the Universal lot. It had this Southwestern style. Everybody called it Taco Bell. But going to meet him was always an experience because they would put you in a room, and you'd sit at this heavy table, and then you'd hear him coming, and they would basically take Spielberg, and he would be like the master mechanic at Jiffy Lube. And he'd go into this room and take a meeting, and then they'd walk him over to the next room, and he'd take a meeting, and then another room, and he'd take a meeting. And he'd work his way down the hall, and that was his day. But it was a lot of fun to be with him. He was just, very loose.
Do you remember any of the suggestions that he made?
Not offhand, maybe because we never put any of them in. No, we may have put a few in. I'm sure we did. But he wasn't, he just wanted a good show. He wasn't really interested in having, something he thought of put in there. It was nice.
So we get to the big one, for me. What is Freakazoid, and how did that come to be?
Oh, Freakazoid is, I won't say an anti-hero. The show is almost anti-superhero concept, where take a kind of wry look at the whole superhero setup as far as stories go. And, just have fun within it. Secret identities and, girlfriends and villains and, just having a good time.
And how did he come to be?
That was mostly, I'm not sure originally, because Paul Dini and Bruce Timm were developing it and had a completely different concept in mind. And then Superman was greenlit somewhere in the middle of this. So they were rushed off to start developing that. And Tom and Paul and I ended up getting handed all their development material on Freakazoid. So we had very little time. It was late in the year, and if it was going to go up in the fall, which it was slated to do, we had to start production in January. So it just became this race to try and figure out who this guy was and what he did. We just threw a lot of stuff in, hoping something clicked. And then Tom wrote a big, thick script of a lot of short bits. And a lot of those were adopted, Handman being one of them, were adapted and just rushed into production.
Now, you wrote the first aired episode, Dance of Doom. Was that the first episode you wrote for Freakazoid, or was that a later script that was moved up?
It wasn't the first. The first one I wrote was something about Freakazoid and a guy called Baron Magneto, who never made the cut. I forget what it was. Freakazoid versus a guy who could magnetize things, and he wins. It was back when we were floundering, trying to find some things that clicked and would seem to drive the character. Dance of Doom was the first one that, kind of saw all the way through.
Can you describe that episode?
An enormous blue caveman is wreaking crime havoc in a city. He's also highly educated and reads the New Yorker, and Freakazoid has to foil him before he attacks high school teenagers at a dance.
I have a list of a couple of episodes that you wrote. Just a thought on each one, if you could. Hot Rods from Heck, based on the Sam Katzman film.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, very nice. That was Maurice LaMarche's Longhorn doing his best Johnny Cash impression. There was a scene in there, and I don't know if it's still in, but a panel opened in the back of the Freakmobile, and a giant hand came out on a spring, and it reaches across the ocean, and it grabs a portion of the Great Wall of China in front of two Chinese men. And I remember Bobby Page, who works for us, we asked her, find out how do you say in Mandarin, look, giant hand? And she called all around and eventually found, Kan, Kixiao, or whatever it was. I think they cut that, though. But we ate up an entire day of her life.
Mission Freakazoid.
Oh, that was the first episode of the second season. It was also the first one we used Jonathan Harris in. I had written him a letter and asked, I don't know why we landed on him, but I'd written him a letter and asked if he wanted to do it. And boy, he was a great guy. Paul and I got to be friends with him. We'd hang out after the show ended. And we'd meet him for lunch every now and again. But he was a real character.
Can you describe the character that he played on Freakazoid?
An officious, arrogant butler who was a coward at heart. We loved to get him to scream. Yeah, and he wouldn't mind doing it either.
How much of him was Dr. Smith?
Most of it. He didn't mind doing that either.
We didn't talk about the voice of Freakazoid. Who was the voice of Freakazoid?
That was Paul Rugg.
How did he get that job?
Interviewing a lot of other guys. Paul had done a lot of voices on Anmaniacs of different characters, so we just put him in there. And I think Tom Ruegger kind of got him to go further and further afield with the character and do wilder things. He's, don't worry, it's just an interview. It was like what Stanley Kubrick did to George C. Scott on Dr. Strangelove, where he told him to just go wild, punch it through the top of the roof. It's just a take. It'll never see the screen. Of course, they all saw the screen. And I think the same thing happened with Paul, and Spielberg loved it. That was that.
So you wrote a couple of the Huntsman sketches on that program, and this is jumping back prior to Mission Freakazoid. But who was the Huntsman?
He was a man bred for action who couldn't find any. I think the main title song was longer than the episodes, deliberately. I actually wrote one at the end of the first season where he's cracking up. He's psychologically deteriorating because he can't find any action. And suddenly a villain shows up, and he answers the call, of the horn of urgency, jumps into action, defeats it, and he kind of goes out on top. But they were so behind then, it never got out of storyboard, which is a shame. I would have liked to have seen him at least notch one villain.
How many episodes were produced for that first season?
Well, I think it was maybe 12 or 12 total, but there were all these tiny little bits from Tom's big script. We were that's far more expensive than just doing half hours. So we were constantly feeding the artists something.
What was the reception of Freakazoid from Warner Brothers Studios at the time?
I don't think they got it, and I don't think they were happy because, believe me, I didn't find this out till later, but in the world of studio accounting, we had to amortize all the previous development work that had been done on it. So that was all tacked on somehow. And so it was one of the most expensive shows they'd ever laid their eyes on. So Gene McCurdy, who was the executive in charge of Warner's back then, the only executive in charge of Warner's animation, she was able to chill him out by saying that we would do half hours the next season and that those would be more cost effective, which they are. And the studio calmed themselves and accepted.
And what was the reception of the show from the viewers when it first aired, if there was reception that you were aware of?
I was not aware of it. It was the dawn of the mass internet, and it was just really starting to become a thing. So I'm not sure at all. We would get letters every now and again from people. People still send letters, or an email once in a while as that started to become popular. But we weren't really, we sensed it was going okay. At least the first season was. The second season was a nightmare because they would not give us a consistent time slot. The head of the WB, Jamie Kellner, was quite blunt. He said he didn't get it, and his 12-year-old daughter didn't get it. I didn't know we were indexing it to his daughter, but apparently we were, and he didn't care for it at all. It got sold to Cartoon Network for the last 2 episodes, I think.
That's where I first saw it.
Oh, okay.
And I was 10, and I got it.
Yeah, it was for a discriminating audience, I like to think.
What do you remember about the episode Statuesque of Freakazoid?
We had a great voice cast on that. We had Richard Mall, who was doing Night Court at the time, very popular show. Andrea Martin from Second City, just a great, funny comedian. Of course, our own Tracy Rowe, one of our regulars. She was Steph, just a beautiful actress to work with. It was a lot of fun.
What were those voice sessions like, and were you there when they would record them?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they were great. Andrea Romano was just phenomenal in terms of her preparation, and she was absolutely ready when it came down to it. And we do a read-through, first of all, just for everyone to get a sense for the timing. And then we'd start recording them, and everybody would be in the studio at the time. You'd do one at a time if you couldn't get anybody because of a booking conflict, but often we'd have the whole cast in there at once. It was really kind of a good feeling and really built up the camaraderie, and it was great to have an audience to play to.
Virtual Freak?
Yeah. Oh, I wrote that with Melody Fox. It was they had put a virtual reality machine in the mall near our offices, and Paul and I used to go over there and play it. And you put on these clunky headsets that made you look like a Starship Trooper or something, and you'd be in this virtual world where you'd try and shoot each other with clunky guns. It was so bizarre and looked absolutely, completely fake. I thought it might be a nice place to put Freakazoid and Cosgrove. Plus, the Babe Heart ending was one of my favorites.
Describe that ending.
They go to see a movie in the end, Freak and Cosgrove and Steph, and it's about a little pig that leads the Scottish in revolt against the English. And there was a big battle scene that was apparently pretty bloody.
Were you surprised or saddened when the show ended, or was canceled, rather?
Yeah, I normally, you just accept it. It's part and parcel. But I had so much fun on it. And I didn't feel they really gave us a fighting chance on the second season. We were just drifting around, and it just seemed remarkably dickish that they wouldn't back us up on that. That's such is the way of things.
It did win the Daytime Emmy
Yes.
for Outstanding Animated Program, and I forgot to mention the Emmy you won for Animaniacs as well. How did it feel to win an Emmy?
That was an amazing 2-week period. So I won the Emmy for Freakazoid, or we did, and then I didn't go to New York for the Animaniacs Emmy because I was getting married over that time period. So I won 2 Emmys and got married all within about 2 weeks. It was just an amazing euphoria. I thought every week should be like that.
I take it they weren't all like that.
Some of them descended rapidly from there. But I just got to say, for all the frustration and the rejection and the hard knocks and eating rice and Campbell's soup and paying your rent with credit cards, you don't remember a minute of it. You're just up there without drugs, high as a kite. It was a great feeling.
After Freakazoid, you wrote for a couple of other shows. I want to talk about Pinky, Elmira, and the Brain. What was that program, and how did that show come about?
That was strange. That came out of, I don't know where. Times were changing at the old Warner Brothers ranch. I think it was the run-up to the AOL buyout. The WB was a power now. I don't think Jean could get shows greenlit on her own anymore. Suddenly we had a phalanx of executives where we'd have none before, and we had to please them. somewhere at a meeting, Christopher Keenan, one of the executives, said, why don't we put Elmira with Pinky and the Brain? The next thing I know, I'm getting a call. It was myself, Rusty Mills, Charlie Howell, Gordon Brasic, Tom Shepard, Wendell Morris, all those guys. They said, what are we going to do with that? So we gave it a go and did the best we could with what we had and try to adapt Pinky and the Brain to their new reality.
And how was that series received?
Not well. The fans hated it. They were absolutely livid, at least from what I was able to find out. The web was starting to exert its influence then. And then the network dropped that show like a dinner plate on concrete and started breaking it up the next season and just, not the next season, it was full episodes for, I think, a couple months, and then they broke it up into smaller sections. Oddly enough, we won an Emmy for that, too. But, once again, they didn't, they just got bored with it after a while.
And you were a producer on that show as well. What was the differences between being a producer and just being a staff writer for a show?
Well, producer, you see it front to back. Well, I don't watch a lot of my old episodes. I just saw them so much at the time, and now I can only see the things I missed or the errors. But a lot of times if you come up with the idea, you'd write it. You'd be there at the voice casting session and the voice recording. Then when it came back from overseas, you'd work on editing it, and then you'd work with Richard Stone or the Bernsteins or whoever was doing the scoring on it, what you wanted in particular, and then you'd lay in sound effects. You'd work with the technicians at the lot on that, and then you'd do the final mix, get all the sound and voice levels right, and out it goes. So that might be 9 months with a big gap in the middle while it's being animated.
After Pinky, Elmira, and the Brain, you did a couple Batman Beyonds. Now, that was a dramatic series. Was it difficult to transition to writing a dramatic script?
Well, it was a matter of priorities. You downplayed the humorous and you upplayed character and plot development. Though Terry's Friend Dates a Robot had a lighter touch than many. Say Armory, which was the other one I did.
Describe Terry's Friend Dates a Robot, which is a great title, by the way.
Yeah, I think it was Dini's originally, or it was his idea, Paul Dini's. I think he came up with that. There was a regular character in the show, the comic relief nerd, who hooks up with a robot, hot-looking robot, who's now his girlfriend. And she's insanely jealous of anyone else and begins to behave in ways that the girlfriend robot shouldn't, menacing characters and what have you. And so Terry has to come up as Batman and put a stop to it.
Now, were you forced to put in pro-social messages into your scripts for Warner Brothers?
No, mercifully no. We were not. We would have made fun of it back then if they'd insisted.
For someone who isn't in the know of, what is a pro-social message?
Don't smoke cigarettes, drugs are bad. Right now it'd be like a lot of PC stuff. Don't hate, don't, things your parents used to teach you. But so we wouldn't, we were not compelled. In later years, it was rampant everywhere. So fortunately, I was on my way out the door then.
Do you remember when you left Warner Brothers?
Yes, it was in 2000. I had done this project overseas with some Warner Brothers characters, and I knew my contract was not being extended. Paul was gone by then. Tom Ruegger was gone. A lot of people were gone. It was definitely changed. What it had been 8 years before, for all the yelling and the chaos and the laughter and everything else like that, that was gone. And it didn't feel bad leaving.
What do you think is the legacy of Warner Brothers animation of the 90s?
It was a type of animation where we didn't have to worry about pro-social or being sued or, lots of fingers in the pie. Gene McCurdy trusted the producers of the shows to come up with the best product. And there was a freedom there that I was never to see again. And I think that the products stand up over time.
So where did you go first after leaving Warner Brothers?
Boy, well, it's like a bad marriage. It never just ends. I was still doing that one overseas project, which went on for years, actually, off and on. And then I did, there was this online Looney Tunes show that I did for a number of episodes there. I did a lot of freelance. I was just freelancing, working different shows. Ozzy and Drex, Jimmy Neutron, just different shows that came up. I didn't really have a steady job, you can believe it, till the end of, for almost 3 years, when I got this thing called Schirn with Berlin Animated Films. It was a animated show for the European cable market. I think you can find episodes on YouTube now, but I ended up story editing that for a while. It was Mitch Schauer was the producer. He had been a producer on the first season of Freakazoid, and he had gone over working in Berlin at the time, and so we'd go back and forth at strange hours of the day and night, but it worked out okay.
What was the plot of that series?
Oh boy. Some 12-year-old boy through, what is it, Morty and Rick?
Rick and Morty?
Yeah, Rick and Morty in a way. So it was like Sherm and his mad scientist grandfather, who accidentally zaps 5 germs that grow into huge size, people sizes, and become the invisible friends, helpers, and tormentors of this young guy.
And where was that? You said it was aired in England. Did that ever see the light of day in the United States or Canada?
Not that I know of. It was for European TV. I never heard what became of it. I did see that there was an episode on YouTube. I'd be interested in tracking that down and seeing how it made it there. But yeah, put that out, and that was the last I ever saw of it.
I have a couple of shows. You already mentioned some of them that you wrote for after you left Warner Brothers. Quick thought, whatever memory comes to mind. Jimmy Neutron, Boy Genius.
Oh yeah. Jed Spingarn, who'd written on a number of shows, he did Johnny Bravo and a number of other shows at Warner Brothers and Cartoon Network. He was the story editor on that. I got to say, he was one of the best story editors I ever worked for. I was a terrible story editor. He was good. He would get the writers he'd guide them in the direction that he wanted them to go and goose them up to do their best work. And I would just rewrite everything. So no, Jed was excellent, really knew his craft.
For someone who may not know, what is a story editor and what role does it play in an animated series?
The story editor is the first guardian of the script. They usually work closely with the producer to shape the tone of the series and the characters. And so you usually work, as a writer, you would work most closely with them in crafting your story, and they make the first cut. They'll usually guide you in where you should go and help you with the rewrites and get it ready to push it on up the chain of command. So it's a vital, important job. Some places have more power than others. It varies. Depends on the strength of the producers and how much the network elects to become involved.
Ozzy and Drix, which was based on Osmosis Jones. You wrote 2 episodes of that. What do you remember about that program?
I was going to be the story editor for that. Alan Burnett wanted to hire me, but I ended up back overseas again on that one project I was talking about. I think he hired Doug Langdale. But Alan was great. Before he'd turn a script into the network, he'd call me up and we'd go over lines and he'd tell me which areas he thought should be stronger, and we'd just figure it out over the phone, and he'd do the last few bits and send it in. So he was always a great guy to work with.
I feel we should talk a little bit about that overseas. I don't know how much you can go into detail of it, but considering how influential it was at the time, what exactly was that project?
There was a serious problem overseas at the time with landmines and unexploded ordnance. A lot of the everywhere that there had been war, but especially Southeast Asia, since some of the areas had been almost 30 years of conflict, and they were just absolutely littered with mines and bombs and booby traps and what have you. So some of the big Warner Brothers executives were in Washington for something, and they got the idea of volunteering the characters, Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny, to be animated and to craft a message that would be played in these countries to warn people against the dangers of messing with this stuff. Now, it seems self-evident. If you live in Sandusky, Ohio, and you come across a mortar shell, you'll tend to leave it alone. But over there, people are so broke, they'll take that thing and they'll try and pull it apart into its components, get the copper banding and get the metal, take the explosive, use it to blow up stumps. A lot of times they blow themselves up. So the goal was that myself, Kathleen Helpe, who ran the classics division at Warner Brothers, went over there. with a member of the Agency for International Development, and we met all these people in NGOs, they're called non-governmental organizations, and got a sense of what things were like over there and how we might come up with characters and what that message might be like. So it's complicated because you're dealing with the government, and then you're dealing with all these different organizations, both local nationals and NGOs from different countries, and everybody's got to prove everything. And it was, I'm glad I went. I'm glad I took part in it, but it would come for a time and we'd work something up and we'd send it out and have to get approval, and then we'd forget about it, go on with our lives. So they'd come back and they want to, do something else, and it just took forever. I'm surprised anything ever gets done. But it was phenomenal. It was fascinating, and I had tremendous sympathy for the people who lived over there. Their experience was ghastly beyond anything I had ever encountered. If we could help out any, I was glad we could.
Now, which countries were you operating out of or working in when you were working on this PSA?
Well, originally they were going to send us to Mozambique, but it was very unstable there, and it had rained heavily, and all the mines had shifted, so they didn't know where they were. So they sent us to Cambodia, where I guess the mines shift less in a monsoon, and we traveled around the country to various spots. We met with demining groups, non-governmental organizations, governmental organizations from both Cambodia and the United States government, State Department, Agency for International Development. Never a dull moment.
Do you remember what year that project took place?
It began in the summer of 2000, and it eventually ended in the spring of 2003. This is off and on, start-stop, waiting for the government to make up its mind.
Did that ultimately get produced and aired?
Did. We eventually came up with a character, a local national character. And, you had to fight over there were a lot of things there that were difficult to overcome. For example, if you went out in the forest to get firewood, and you stepped on a Soviet PMN-2 mine and blew your foot off at the knee, there'd be a tendency for people to think that your parents had done something wrong because of karma and reincarnation, that you had your part in it. It was your fault or the fault of your family. So you had to kind of work against that and maybe convince people that, sometimes things just happen and they're not related to that. And so you shouldn't discriminate against people who have lost their limbs. And many, many had over there.
You said that you did an Ozzy and Drix over there. Were you frequently writing while you were working on this project, writing for other animated series?
Yeah, I had to. It would only pay up to a point, and then it would stop. Then you'd have to do something else to try and pay the mortgage.
How did that work out?
Things were slow. There were two things were going on. 2000, The First Survivor was a tremendous hit, and it really changed the face of television. So a lot of times, the shows that were doing sitcoms started dropping them to start doing reality shows. So what happens is we ended up getting a lot of TV animation writers rolling down into the animation world, and they were kind of flooding the zone. At the same time, Hannah Montana was such a tremendous success at Disney that they just wanted to come up with a second Hannah Montana. So they started doing a number of shows, huge amount of live action shows. And Disney is usually it's an evergreen in terms of cranking out animation, but for a few years there they weren't. So the business was just going through one of its periodic changes, so there really wasn't a lot of work back then.
How did you get by? Was the landmine project enough to pay by, or did you have to take other work?
No, the landmine project was embarrassingly cheap. I mean, to fight like a dog just to get business class over to Asia. They wanted to put me in steerage, tape me underneath the airplane. So yeah, it was a battle. So yeah, I was doing whatever I could. Paul and I worked on a screenplay, went out and shopped that around. Paul had a great idea for a movie. It was about a bunch of actors that have to go through the actor boot camp, and then they're parachuted into a country, and then by accident they end up in the middle of a war, and they have to put their skills to use. And we found out later that there was something called Tropic Thunder being done, basically the same thing. But we got a lot of meetings out of it.
Any particular memorable meetings with any companies in regards to that story?
No, we weren't big shots in film. Hollywood's very cliquish. So since we didn't really have a track record in film, we would always meet the first gatekeeper, and to be the lowest level executive, takes meetings from guys like us. So, it was fine. We went all over the place. We did a ton of them. I remember we had to shoehorn them all in because I was leaving again for overseas. So we did like 3 in a day, and then we do 2 another day, and then we did like 4, a poor agent. But she worked it out, but nothing really became of that.
You brought up Disney. You wrote for Dave the Barbarian.
Yes.
What do you remember about that series?
That was Doug Langdale's baby. He was a very funny guy. Yeah, it was fun just turning that stuff out. And I think Paul did a voice on it as well. It was pretty good. There were a lot of fun things.
Was writing for Disney different than writing for Warner Brothers?
Not for Dave the Barbarian, since I only really weren't that many people involved in the chain of command. But like I said, Warner Brothers in the 90s was a rarity. Disney, when I worked for them, were very corporate. Writers, you had story editor, you had the producer, you had the show executive, then you had other executives, marketing would look at it, this and that. You're more a cog than a writer, participant in a process.
And another big entity for Nickelodeon, Cat Scratch. Any memories of that series?
Oh yeah, that was great. There was Peter Hastings, Doug Tennepool was there, a couple other people that I knew from Warner Brothers. But it was a lot of fun. I wish I had done more, but I had gotten that job with Disney, so I ended up going over there for 6 weeks. But yeah, it looked like a fun show. It looks like they had a blast with it.
Were you ever hesitant prior to your work on Animaniacs to write for children's programming?
No, I never really we never really thought of it as that. They took a lot of us right out of sketch comedy, improv comedy. Paul, myself, Peter Hastings, Deanne Oliver. So we were used to just writing something funny that we were going to be tested on very soon by strangers. So there was an emphasis to make it as good as you could, as fast as you could, and get it out there. And we never really, that's probably what sunk us, is because we didn't think about writing for kids, or that our target audience was 12 years old. Our target audience ended up being like 18 years old to 20 something. And we weren't selling advertising around that. We were selling advertising for 12-year-old squirt your sister guns or something, whatever they were selling. So that scuttled Warner Brothers TV animation.
What are some of the difficulties for writing a children's television show?
Oh, I think it's lecturing them, talking down to them. The big word was, aspirational. You want characters that kids want to be like, which are usually a few years older than your target audience. So the 7, 8-year-olds want to be 12, and the 12s want to be teenagers. And teenagers want to be left alone with the house for a weekend. So, it's finding a way to get your story across without patronizing children.
Biker Mice from Mars?
Oh, yeah. That had a pedigree on it, I think. That had been around a while as it was a comic or a graphic novel or something like that. I remember did a couple of those. Rich Aarons was one of the artists, Warner Brothers, good guy, worked with us on Freakazoid. He was involved in that.
What was, and I hope I pronounced this right, Animalia?
Oh, yeah. It was a very successful children's book by Graham Hancock, I think, an Australian. And there was a movement afoot to bring it to life as a animated series for PBS. So it had to please people in Australia. I think the BBC was putting up some of the money. And then Tom was in charge of the story editing. And so he used a lot of us. He used Deanne Oliver, Sherri, myself, in writing the episode. It was tough because their budget was so small. You had to reuse a lot of things. You had to not do a lot of things. I think they did it CGI, or whatever CGI was 12 or 13 years ago. And it was much more problematic and touchy than it is now.
Do you remember the first time you were aware of computer-generated animation?
Yeah. It was in the 90s. Tim Sarnoff, I forget his position there, but he was one of the first ones to use backgrounds, animated CGI backgrounds in Batman. the animated series, which was easier then because you could do them all dark and they would blend well. And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. So in other words, instead of having the background artists fashioned all that, put it up CGI. It was early on in the 90s or so.
Is it harder to write for CGI? Did that have any other constraints that a normal script didn't have?
I think at that time, for Animalia, it did, just because of their budget concerns. So they really didn't want to do certain things, not a lot of open water, which was hard to do back then, and certain other elements. Normally you don't think about that unless you're the producer, but it had actual effect on what you could put into a script, so it ended up affecting us.
Do you have any examples of how it affected you on that program?
Locations mostly, jungles or, water, as I mentioned. These other things that just really affected where you could put the character, which affected action, story.
Pink Panther and Pals?
Oh, my good old friend Ken Siegel, who worked on, I think he worked on a Freakazoid script, but he was story editing that. You see how things come full circle. Anyway, he was story editing that and got me a few scripts from that. But yeah, it came at the right time. I needed it.
Scooby Doo, Mystery Incorporated, one of my favorites. You wrote Grasp of the Gnome, one episode.
Oh, yeah. Mitch Watson, another guy who freelanced on Freakazoid. I used him on Sherm, so he was story editing there. I think Bruce Timm was doing the artwork at the time. But it was interesting, they were keeping... That Scooby Doo thing is just... it's been around longer than sand. I don't know how it does it, but it always finds a new life.
Do you remember the first time you became aware of Scooby Doo?
I might have been in high school then. That's how long ago it was. It had a punchy little song to it. It was trying to look very now. No one thought it was, but it was just a fun little show. And then of course, the Mike Myers and the company made fun of it. And,
Wayne's World?
Yeah, Wayne's World. That ended up being the punchline for the show.
Did you try to bring anything to those characters in that script in regards to the older series, or were you pretty much constricted to what Mitch Watson had entailed for those characters?
Yeah, who was there? Well, Spike Brandt was there also, and Tony Cervoni. They were handling the artwork, and they all had a pretty firm idea of how they wanted that done. So it was basically syncing up to what they wanted to see, how they wanted to see the characters react. It was fine.
Is it true that you don't like to rewatch the things that you wrote?
Yes, great difficulty watching.
Do you think that's normal for a writer?
I don't know. It's the same thing with things I write. It's difficult to go back and look at things because I just see the missed opportunities, and I think it's a failing. I should be able to look at it critically and draw out the good and the bad, but for some reason it's just easier to move on.
A few more shows you wrote for, and then we'll head on to the book territory. Kung Fu Panda, Legends of Awesome.
Oh yeah, I think that was Nickelodeon. There was Peter Hastings there and Scott Kramer. Fun little show.
Mr. Peabody and Sherman Show?
Yeah, DreamWorks had great hopes for that show. Paul was story editing, a couple other guys, and I think they really thought that thing was going to take off based on the movie. Then the movie tanked, and shortly after that, so did the show.
Well, was it different writing for Netflix than for writing for television?
Yeah, no, it's their writing process was different. It was more collegial. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but anyway, you do an outline, and then you'd sit in a room with a bunch of people and talk it out. I wasn't sure where it was going or what became of it. I just knew it's my job to get the outline in. And I sat in one session. At the end, we realized that everything we worked for an hour and a half crafting wasn't really the show. I thought, oh, this has been fruitful. So that was the last one I had to go to, thank God.
How so? How did it not end up being your outline? Did network change it, or did the...
I think what happens sometimes is when you get in a room of people, and there's an energy in the room, and that can tend to predominate. And sometimes you can forget some of the fundamental things that you're supposed to be working on because everybody's fired up and you're building something and it's going great. And unfortunately, no one's keeping a cool head there. So it happens. Some shows are great at that. Simpsons Can't argue with success. It's been a mixed bag for me. I've seen it work poorly and work okay.
What would you say was the most fun show to write for that didn't end up becoming a huge success, if such an experience happened?
Happened depressing regularity. So Freakazoid probably.
And were there any that were the inverse, that were not fun to participate in that ended up becoming huge successes?
Yeah, no, I can't recall any nothing comes to mind.
You wrote one segment for New Looney Tunes. I know it as Wabbit.
Oh yeah, I went in to be auditioned for story editor on that, but they weren't sure how they wanted to do it. Initially, they wanted to do it with all freelance writers, so you'd have your work cut out for you as a story editor. You'd have to be dealing with a horde of people all the time. But then eventually they decided to do it where they would put it up on the board, as it's called. They'd have the artist storyboard it, and then the story editor would write a outline, and then you'd go in and you'd sit in the room with the crew and come up with dialogue and, gags and storyline and what have you.
One of my favorites, the 7D.
Oh, yeah.
With a lot of former Anmaniacs writers on that program.
Oh, yeah. Sherri, Roger Eschbacher, Paul, Deanna. Yeah, there's quite a Randy Rugell, I think, did a number of those. Yeah, so that was a long time. Tom was working on that for years.
Do you remember either of the two that you ended up writing?
Not that well. I wrote one of the first ones, and then wrote one in the middle of it somewhere.
Was it good to get all the Animaniacs people back together, or was it just, did you guys even meet as often as you did when you did Animaniacs?
No, I wasn't in there. So, I was freelance, so I wasn't in there with them. But, yeah, a lot of us see each other, or at least stay in touch pretty often. So
It's the last television credit I can find for you as a writer. Did you do work on any other programs after that?
I did. It was non-union stuff. I think one of the last things I did, I was working with a company in Singapore. In fact, that could well be the last Skype call I ever made till now. So thanks, Josh, for getting me off Skype abstinence. That one never came up. A couple of them didn't. Amazon had a project where they wanted to do these short, punchy little stories that they text out or something like that. That never went. There was another Amazon thing. They were looking for original ideas. I went over and pitched them. So there were, a number of things, but finally it was just better to retire than keep going. Your shelf life tends to go after a while in animation. People become afraid of you because you're older than their parents. So
How much did you write during that era when you were a television writer that was never television or cinematically intended?
Well, like fiction or?
Fiction, nonfiction, books, print media, articles, anything that wasn't intended for a viewership, that was intended to be read rather than interpreted as a film or such.
Not that much when things were going good. Wrote a lot when they weren't.
So you wrote a book about your experiences with prostate cancer. Was that the first book you wrote?
No.
What was?
I think the first novel-length book I wrote was a parody of 50 Shades of Grey. It was called 50 Shades of Zane Grey. It was set in the Old West. It's kind of a PG version of the popular novel.
Where did that idea come from?
The movie was coming out. It was tremendous press around it, and I thought I'd try and cash in the notoriety.
And how was that received?
It wasn't. Like giving your girlfriend the gift of wasps. You just don't, just didn't really go anywhere. It was, me and 10,000 other guys had the same idea, of course.
Was that the first one you wrote under the pseudonym?
Oh, J.P. Mac? No, I had done a sort of an essay on my experiences in jury duty, and I realized that you needed a shorter name to fit on a thumbnail descriptor online. So I shortened my name to J.P. Mac and started using it as that. And then the second one I wrote was a kind of a parody of New Age and marketing, a little book of big enlightenment, which is probably the closest, most surreal, freakazoidish thing I've ever written. And then I wrote a novel called Hollow Mass, which was a takeoff on the Lovecraftian world of Arkham, Massachusetts, and his strange mythos of bizarre beings and a kind of a party girl who must, in a Buffy-like manner. And then I think I was ready to do this very short book on prostate cancer, mostly because I'd taken notes during the experience and felt like somebody else might have gone through the same thing. Might be a help.
What did you try to bring into that book?
Well, I want to let people know there's hope. I had a particularly, let's say, virulent, but my recovery was beset by strange and unpleasant things such as, blood pressure cratering and horrible abdominal pains and blood clots. There was just all kinds of things went wrong. And by the time I got out of the hospital, I was exhausted. But most people don't go through that who have that kind of surgery. Most guys are out pretty soon and back up and around in no time. And so I figured if they go through anything that isn't what I went through, they got off pretty light. And a lot of women read it because, the men in their lives, their brothers, husbands, fathers are going through this. And they want some idea of what that experience could be like. So I wanted to let them know you can find the funny in it if you like, and there is hope.
Thank you for that hope. Could you talk about, actually, before we talk about that, something I didn't bring up, one of my favorite facets. Could you talk about Toby Danger?
Oh, geez, yeah. That was phenomenal. I tried to get a spin-off series going on that, but couldn't swing it at the time. Yeah, that was Tom Minton mostly who really did the Johnny Quest parody, and really we got some of the Don Messick, who'd been a voice on the original Hanna-Barbera show, was one of our voices. And Tom and the artists that worked on that were really responsible for just nailing it on the head. They crushed it.
And that was Freakazoid, right, that was a part of?
Yes, first season.
What's the story about trying to pitch it for a series?
I talked to Gene McCurdy and see if we could do that, but at the time, DreamWorks still owned a portion of Freakazoid, every other show that they'd done in cooperation with Warner Brothers back in the day. By then, Spielberg had calved off and formed DreamWorks, and so he was basically a competitor now. So we couldn't really do anything with any of the properties until such time as an arrangement was made, which it wasn't, I think, for another 10 years or so.
What would it have been if it had gotten picked up?
It would have kept that spirit alive of the original one, of the earnest seekers of science, fouling everything up, and yet things turn out okay in the end.
Were you ever disappointed that Toby Danger didn't come to pass?
I thought it would have been. People ask me about that episode. I won't say more than anything else, but a lot. And I think it really struck a chord. It would have done, I believe, quite well.
What are you currently working on as of this interview?
Mostly I'm writing short fantasy, short stories. Going through a change where I'm kind of revamping how I approach writing, trying to make it more character-oriented and looking more at what kind of character I'm putting in there and what sort of setting it is, and really working with narrative and conflict and trying to get in a little more deeper than I have.
Professionally speaking, what would you say is your proudest achievement?
Well, I'd like to think that the thing I'm most proud of I haven't done yet. I'd like to think there's one or two good stories left in me, and that, God willing, one of those will be my epitaph or on a wanted poster, one of the two. But until then, I'm glad to accept anything I did in the 90s at Warner Brothers. It was a great time, a wonderful place, and I'm proud of the work we did.
What would you say is your biggest regret or disappointment in regards to your work in the medium?
I think I was always my own worst enemy. Never where I should have been, and I was always looking for that green grass on the other side of the hill, and I never really planned. I mostly led a very serendipitous life. I think I would have given it a little more thought.
What advice would you have for someone who wanted to work in the world of television, animation or otherwise?
I would tell them, find out about the business end. I always had to learn that the hard way, but find out how they make their money, and that you're going to be a part of that. And doesn't mean skimp your craft, but learn a little bit about the business end of things. And I would say stay in the moment and focus on the projects you have in front of you, and not the one you wish you had.
In regards to your work, what do you think is the one thing you would like people to take away from John McCann and his writing style?
That the world is a funny place, and there are dark things out there and unpleasant things, but basically your attitude determines your level of happiness.
Thank you for telling your story.
Thanks for asking.